Dear IATA members and friends of IATA, welcome to the 16th Annual Nordic Security Conference. My name is KARL MANDELID and I'm the International Coordinator of IATA Norway. It is my great pleasure to start this year's conference by welcoming all of the speakers, attendees, and my fellow IATA members. The title of this year's conference is The Arab Spring, a Decade Later. The conference takes a broad security perspective and builds on how events in one situation in one region also affects the security situation elsewhere, specifically in the northern region. In addition to this overarching perspective, we will focus on great power politics and the development of specific states in the Middle East. During the conference, participants will have the opportunity to learn and interact with leading experts in the field of security policy. Our aim for the conference is to present multiple perspectives and facilitate a discussion on the topic. There will be 4 sessions spread over 3 days. Each of the 4 sessions will focus on different aspects, such as social and extremist movements, great power politics, and human rights. Today's topic is the last decade in review. The COVID-19 crisis continues to change the world, including the Nordic region. While we believe now more than ever in the importance of bringing people together, we have decided to move the content of NorSec 2021 online to ensure that no one will lose out. We will do our best to facilitate interaction between the participants and the speakers, so please use the chat functions to give comments and ask questions. We sincerely hope you will enjoy the conference. On behalf of IATA Norway, thank you for your participation. First off, we have opening remarks from investigative journalist and author ØYSTEIN WINDSTAD. He has worked in Egypt from 2011 until 2019 and has also reported from Russia and Chechnya. WINDSTAD has worked for the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation and has reported for Norwegian national newspapers such as Dagbladet. ØYSTEIN, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl, for the introduction. And first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share some thoughts and to share stage with renowned scientists and researchers such as Sverre LODGAARD, and also to share stage with the Norwegian Minister of Defense and also Kate Hansen BUNDT. It's inspiring. First off, I would like to, in my presentation talk, I will talk about Egypt in 2011 and from 2011 and also until now. And I will also share with you the best day of my life, which is also the worst day of my life. That was in Cairo in 2013, on the day I got married in Cairo. And that was the day, officially I'd say, that the Arab Spring in Egypt and in Cairo turned into a bloody winter. And towards the end, I will share with you what some of you might know. The previous president Donald Trump, being Donald Trump, what he called and named quite publicly the now president of Egypt at the G7 summit in 2019. We'll get there. So, 2011 is my first trip to Egypt and my first trip to Cairo. I walk out of the hotel and I go down to this massive open square. And in this massive open square in the middle of the million city Cairo in the metropolis, it's thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people sitting, standing, dancing. It's women with hijab, it's women without hijab, it's children, it's men, it's adults, young, it's all types of different people gathered in this Tahrir square, which has become the symbol of the Arabic Spring. And I go down there I'm a journalist, and Mubarak had just resigned. So I go down there to talk to the people who had participated in the Arabic Spring, to hear their thoughts. Why are they there? what are they hoping for, and what is it that they have been experiencing. And I remember in particular I met a female, a woman, a young woman about my age, who worked as a journalist, and I started asking her, and your parents didn't want you to be here even, and yet you went here with the dangers it faced you to go here with the other people. You defy your parents, and why did you do all of this? And then she said, at this time, when Mubarak was the president, it was a military rule. Working as a journalist was almost like a joke because I couldn't write what I thought. I couldn't say what I thought. I couldn't speak my mind. There was nothing I could do. My friends, I have friends with very, very good grades. They're engineers and they have top grades, very bright, shining young people, and they cannot get jobs. And she told me also she saw people who had just finished, young students who just finished high school with top grades. Very, very hardworking, smart young people. They could not get into the universities they wanted to and should be according to their grades because kids or students with connected or rich parents, they got there instead. And they mentioned again, this journalist and many others at Tahrir Square, they mentioned again and again and again the corruption, the bakshish, the money that you have to pay under the table to get just about anything done. But she and the other, they were so hopeful back in 2011, and they knew that next year there would be an election. And they were so hopeful, for a new bright future for the country and a new turn. And 1 year passed, and many of you know that there were in the initial round you had 5 candidates that you can choose from, and then there was 2 candidates left. The 2 that got the most votes from the initial round of the presidential election, 2 were left. And the choice that the voters and the citizens had in the history, the first free election in the history of Egypt, that was officer, a general from the Air Force with, I'd say, close ties with the previous Mubarak regime. Basically a continuation of the previous regime, which in all honesty, it must be said that quite a few people supported the old regime also. And many saw them as a stabilizing factor because they represented the armed forces. So you had the old regime basically in this hand, and in the other hand you had Mohammed Mursi from the Muslim Brotherhood. There was a Islamistic movement that was also quite popular, especially in the rural areas. And the election came, and Mursi was elected. He won by 1% of the votes back in 2012. And he and his government, the Muslim Brotherhood, they governed the country for just about 1 year. Some liked them, some strongly disliked them, and in particular the armed forces, the old power holders, they did not like him at all. And now we move back forward in time to the summer of 2013, and as many of you remember, then in protest, or how to say, in protest of Mursi was doing, at least claiming, this general Abdul el-Sisi, I think he was also the previous intelligence, head of the Egyptian intelligence, Egyptian army strongman. He took power with a military takeover or coup, whatever you want to call it. And as that happened, when the military regained their power, thousands upon people went back to Tahrir to protest. Not only Tahrir, many different places all over Cairo. And now we're back in August. It's the 14th of August 2013. I'm about to get married. I'm nervous, as you are on your wedding day. My lovely wife, she's from Yemen. Her family came from Yemen to Cairo, and my family came from Norway, Oslo, to Cairo. We kind of met in the middle in order for us to get married. And on my wedding day, 7 o'clock approximately in the morning, I'm awakened by this large, like very strong sound. And I stumbled, half awake, half asleep out of the bed, go to the hotel balcony, the hotel room, and I pull the curtains outside, pull the curtains aside, and I look out. I open the door and look out, and just above my head, there's a large military helicopter hovering with armed people with automatic weapons hanging out of the doors. And then I hear the shooting, and then I hear the screaming. Literally just hundreds of meters away. I can see it and I can hear it. The military is manifesting its return and the way they want to rule this country. It was a sit-down protest just outside the hotel, just next to the Cairo University, a square full of thousands of people who are protesting against the military takeover. And the army went in against the protesters with automatic rifles, armored cars, tanks, helicopters, whatever you can imagine. And it was mostly peaceful protesters. And that is a day I will never forget. I remember the screams, I remember the sounds, I remember the sights, even the smell of the army going in and doing what they did towards the protesters. And I guess that was the day when the Arabic Spring was crushed, as I said, into a bloody winter for Egypt. And after that, when Abdel Fattah Sisi had said, what worked before will not work again, you saw quite peaceful, mild oppositional voices from before that was tolerated under Mubarak even. They were put to jail. They put family members of the Muslim Brotherhood in jail. They had trials where members of the Muslim Brotherhood, by let's say 100 people of them, were on trial in the same time. The trial lasted for an hour and they got lifetime or worse. And that was basically the army coming back and taking over and say, we'll have no more of this. Now you will have stability and security and no more of this. Muslim Brotherhood. And we can fast forward now to 2019. I land back again in Cairo, and I'm curious how people see, how are they living now, how are their lives now. So I land in Cairo, I go out of the airport and I go into a taxi, and luckily the taxi driver is speaking a little bit English. So I ask him while we drive towards the city center how it's like, and I crack jokes, but like, how is it with the new guys in the government now? And then he stops talking completely. His eyes goes back. You see his eyes in the mirror, in the rear view mirror, and his eyebrows are going down, and he's looking at me for what I feel for like forever. And the only thing he says, it's difficult. And then he doesn't want to talk anymore about any of that. He just mentioned though that the same year in 2019 that the Egyptian pound is no longer pegged, so it's inflation. He mentioned that the gasoline for the cab drivers and everyone else the gasoline prices are increasing a lot. The prices for cooking gas, I think, went from 30 Egyptian pounds for 25 liters of cooking gas, propane, to 130 in just that year. And in the same time also the government had implemented or imposed VIT, tax on goods and services, 14%. All of this in just one short period of time. And in a democracy as we live in, we are kind of used to that. You can do those things, but through reform, it will not be accepted if you do it just in within 1 year. And so people had much less money because of inflation, and the prices they were rising a lot. So it was tough financially and economically for the people living there back in 2019. And the view from our allies, the United States, on Sisi was, I guess, expressed in a way at the G7 summit, which I mentioned. Donald Trump was looking for Sisi. He likes Sisi, so he wants to meet him and tell him that. And he saw Sisi and went like this: "Where is my favorite dictator?" And Sisi became very quiet, according to the people who saw this, and he didn't like it. But Trump, he meant it well, because he sees him as a representative of something predictable, something stable and something that he can work with. And I guess that is representative also of the previous president that might express himself in a different way, I guess, but it's kind of, I think it speaks for the, yeah, the way they see it. So, and also, in order to understand the why the armed forces are so powerful in Egypt is, if you look at the economy, half of the money in circulation in Egypt are within the army economy. Half of it. They have also the money that the taxpayers are paying that goes to the armed forces is unknown, because they have basically secret budgets. You don't know how much or how the money is being spent, so they don't have to answer to basically anyone. And one in science of political science and economics, we know what that can lead to. So the army is back now. In the same time, the people who were there at Tahrir Square protesting, they have smartphones, they have access to social media, they know and remember still, the ones I talked to that dare to talk, they know how life was back then, and people are poorer now, or at least very, very difficult economical situation. And that leads me to the final story I would like to share with you tonight. Now we go back to 1798. Napoleon came to invade, with his campaign to invade Egypt in 1798. And he was known for, he could turn just about anyone his way without firing one single bullet. He was looking for exact that thing when he came to Egypt, when he landed in the harbor of Alexandria. Beautiful harbor, big one. And he landed there and was wanting to turn everything over in Egypt and make it go his way, like he was known for. So he goes disembarked out of his ship, and he steps out of the harbor, according to the legend, folklore of this story. And the first thing he asked the people there is, what is the price of bread in Egypt? And with that, I would like to say thank you for inviting me here.
Thank you very much for your contribution, ØYSTEIN. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Kate Hansen BUNDT, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee. She has a prestigious track record as a political scientist and foreign policy analyst. She is chair of the board at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, a board member of the Norwegian Center for Conflict Resolution, a member of the CSIS Stewart Center Advisory Council, and a member of the council at Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo.
Program. I would also like to thank you for inviting me back to open this conference, emphasizing the strong and good relationship between the Norwegian Atlantic Committee and YATA. YATA Norway is a highly successful organization, all thanks to you, young people volunteering to create debate and interest in matters related to security, defense, and foreign policy. The Norwegian Atlantic Committee and YATA share the same mandate, namely to contribute to fact-based knowledge sharing on developments in foreign, defense, and security matters. Therefore, I think it is great to see how we complement each other and organize thought-provoking conferences to our respective networks. I am sure that we will be able to continue this fruitful cooperation in the years to come. Speaking today from my home office in the midst of a challenging global pandemic illustrates that we live in a fragile and a rapidly changing world. Rapid change was also something that hit us in December 2010, when a young Tunisian fruit seller set himself alight in protest against the harassment and humiliation he experienced from his own authorities. His act marked the beginning of what became the Arab Spring. Accounts of the young man's act rippled through the region, spread from his Tunisia to Egypt, Syria, Libya, as well as other states. Today, more than a decade after the uprising began, little has improved for those who demanded a better life and stood up against autocratic rulers or North African and Middle Eastern countries. The chain of uprising that trembled both the region and the world has led to devastating long-term consequences, and most of the countries that were affected by protests are still ruled by despotic regimes today, unfortunately. The war in Syria represents the worst conflict in a generation. The war has made the country a regional and an international battleground, literally a field of active military battle among a wide range of opposing parties. After a decade of horrific violence and human tragedies that made Syria the defining war of the early 21st century, the fighting has tapered off, but the suffering has not. The developments caused a severe humanitarian disaster. Since 2011, 6 million Syrians have been uprooted from their homes but remain displaced inside their own country. Another 6 to 7 million have been forced to flee their country. Some of them became part of a wave of refugees reaching the shores of Europe. The flow of migrants that peaked in 2015 and 16 has continued even during the pandemic. The world has witnessed the largest refugee crisis since 1945. Let me be clear. I do not consider people escaping war and misery a threat to European security. But unfortunately, the refugee crisis has led to political fragmentation and polarization between European countries, as well as inside many European states, still evident today. Images of refugees drowning or experiencing other brutal conditions as they sacrifice their lives on the way to Europe have affected us all. In the autumn of 2015, German Chancellor Angela Merkel opened Germany's borders, and almost a million walked in. That decision was hailed by many as the right thing to do at that moment, but it was soon criticized, and its political implications were far-reaching both for Germany and for Europe. In Germany, the relatively newly established right-wing party, AfD, got new winds in their sails, and in the following elections became the third largest party in the German Bundestag, or parliament. In the European Union, Merkel's decision resulted in new divisions, partly between the Union's eastern and western member states. The crisis exposed severe shortcomings in Europe's asylum system, but it was above all a huge stress test for core European values, such as respect for human dignity, human rights, and solidarity. This became obvious at the height of the crisis, when the EU reached a highly controversial agreement with Turkey designed to stop migrants from entering Europe. Migrants that have fled war, hunger, and poverty, hoping for a brighter future in the European continent. The United Kingdom's vote to leave the EU was also in part a reaction to the refugee crisis triggered by the Syrian uprising and the subsequent civil war. This is an example on how populists in time of crisis can use fear and insecurities to their advantage. Moreover, we have seen the destabilization of the North African and Middle East region has created fertile ground for terrorist organizations. In the chaos that followed the eruption of civil war in Syria, the most violent group in modern jihad, the so-called Islamic State, proclaimed a caliphate straddling Syria and Iraq that reshaped global terrorism. This took us all by surprise, and once again it showed how fast things can change in international politics. ISIL brought brutal terror both to the Middle East as well as to European cities. ISIL has also attracted young European citizens to leave their life behind and become foreign fighters in their name. In order to fight back ISIL, Norwegian armed forces have taken part in a collective mission training Iraqi forces, enabling them to defend against and overcome the threat made by ISIL. Our contribution to this operation continues to this day. In sum, all this show how the world is interconnected and how events taking place in one part of the globe might lead to consequences in a totally different part of the world. This can also be illustrated by how a large number of refugees from the Middle East in 2016 crossed the Russian-Norwegian border in the high north at Storskog on bicycles. This showed us that what happens in North Africa and the Middle East region concerns us in North Europe as well. The Norwegian Atlantic Committee and IATA are two organizations that both facilitate discussions and debates on foreign affairs and security issues relevant to the Atlantic Alliance. Our job is to create an arena for information sharing and networking, and to provide fact-based knowledge on issues that shape the transatlantic area. This is a very important job, especially in times when different forces and domestic developments try to pull us apart. A big part of this is also to openly debate and evaluate if things could have been done differently in any given situation. Therefore, NORSEC 2021 is so important. We must dare to look back and dig deep into what was done and examine the consequences of those choices made. Only then will we be better prepared for the next challenges, whatever it might be. Thank you for listening. Good luck, and may you have a fruitful and intriguing conference.
Next, it is my honor to introduce Norway's Minister of Defense, Frank BAKKE-JENSEN. Since 2017, he has served as Minister of Defense. Before that, he was Minister of European Economic Council and EU Affairs. He is a politician for the Conservative Party and is a representative from Finnmark and has been since 2009. From 2007, he was mayor in Båtsfjord in north of Norway. So, Minister, the floor is yours.
That's the way to reach Europe. Thank you again for the invitation and dear IATA members. It has been 10 years since the events of 2011 in the Arab world, which we now call the Arab Spring. These events had consequences in the region. They also had consequences for international security. Today, I will speak about what this has meant for international security. I think this will be a good starting point for your discussions over the next few days. The Arab Spring were a series of local protests against regimes across northern Africa and the Middle East during the spring of 2011. The protests have highlighted issues that will challenge Western security for some time to come. These challenges include difficulties for democracy to take hold after popular protests, the tendency of strongmen to grab power, and mass migration. We also see some topics within the Western alliance in facing these issues. These topics include the responsibility to protect versus non-intervention, tensions within NATO, and burden sharing between the US and European allies. Towards the conclusion, I will visit NATO's response to deal with the fallout of the Arab Spring and its aftermath, including Norway's contributions. In most Arab countries, protests were followed by governments striking down protests, continued unrest, or war. In Egypt, we saw a brief surge of democracy from 2011 to 2013, followed by a coup by the armed forces, which still hold power. In Bahrain, the government was swift to put down the protests, assisted by neighboring states which did not want further spread of the protests. In Yemen, leadership was deposed, but the country has since been ravaged by war. In both Libya and Syria, protests led to bloody civil wars that are still ongoing. Tunisia is the only country where democracy has taken hold, most likely because the country had a moderate form of dictatorship. It is interesting that Iraq saw less popular protests, possibly because it's already had a form of democracy. This all suggests that a democracy seldom develops and thrives on its own. It takes time and support for it to put down roots. In the absence of democracy, we have seen strongmen grabbing power. In Bahrain, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, rulers have promised stability in return for people giving up their civil rights. In countries with weak democratic traditions and surrounded by conflict, this can have considerable appeal. In Syria, Assad had kept his grip on the population through 10 years of conflict, portraying himself as the protector against violent extremism. An additional challenge is that the most important effort to promote stability in Syria is the Astana process, led by President Vladimir Putin of Russia. It is unlikely that peace talks led by an autocratic leader will address the root causes of the conflict in Syria, including the need to guarantee human rights and democracy. For many years, bad governance, poverty, and population growth had caused people in the region to seek better lives in Europe. The war in Syria has caused more people to flee, and the fall of Gaddafi in Libya has opened up a route for migrants from the Sahel region. Europe was not prepared for this development. Especially frontline states like Greece and Italy had problems with a huge number of arriving migrants, leading to the end of the so-called Dublin Agreement. This is not a security crisis. However, this mass migration towards Europe caused huge problems among EU members, which for the most part also are NATO members. For NATO and for Norway, this has several consequences, including the need to consider the responsibility to protect against the costs of doing so. In 2011, NATO led an air campaign aimed at protecting Libyan protesters against their leader, Muammar al-Gaddafi. The operation was successful in preventing civilians from being attacked and contributed to the fall of Gaddafi. However, as we know, this did not lead to national unity in Libya. While the air campaign succeeded in protecting the population, NATO member states has reflected on the complexity of engaging in such situations. One result of our experience from Libya has been reduced will among allies to consider new interventions to save people from dangerous rulers. These were the challenges. Now let us look at the strategies to contain these challenges. After more than 70 years, NATO remains the main forum for Euro-Atlantic security policy deliberation. This is because the alliance has been successful in adapting to changes in the security environment. NATO will continue to succeed in this regard in the future. Neither the cause nor the consequences of the current unrest are military in nature. The main responsibility for addressing the causes rests with the affected countries. The key to this will be to guarantee basic human security for people in these countries. Access to food, health and education will be necessary. However, that will not be enough. People must also have freedom of speech, religious freedom, and they must be able to vote in free and fair elections. Only the countries themselves can do this, with the assistance of the United Nations and development organizations. Still, there are valuable roles for NATO to fill, and NATO fills them. Through the Mediterranean Dialogue and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, NATO has regular contact with most of the affected countries. Through practical cooperation, we work to improve democratic control over their security forces and to increase their effectiveness. NATO has established so-called Hub for the South in Naples. The hub increases our situational awareness in the Middle East and in Northern Africa. This prevents allied policymakers with an up-to-date and coherent picture. This way, NATO will be better placed to make good decisions. The alliance is also involved in Iraq through NATO's military mission in Iraq, NMI, reflecting Iraq's status as a NATO partner nation. I would like to stress that this is an advisory mission. NATO will not replace the US-led Operation Inherent Resolve in operations against ISIL. Norway contributes to such measures, politically and financially, through trust fund contributions. We will also provide personnel to NATO's military efforts in Iraq. For us, this is an investment in our own security. NATO is only as strong as its members makes it. Even though the challenges from the Arab Spring takes place a long way from Norway, we contribute to NATO's response. This is because Norway needs all members to find the alliance relevant to their security needs, so that they keep investing in it. This will ensure that NATO maintains the credibility required to support our security priorities in the High North. Apart from NATO, Norway has long-standing contributions to other peace efforts in the region, including UNSO and MFO in the Middle East and MINUSMA in Mali. In Operation Inherent Resolve in Iraq, Norwegian Army and Special Forces personnel have contributed to the defeat of ISIL since 2014. The protests across Northern Africa and the Middle East in early 2011 set in motion a series of events that we have yet to see the end of. From the program, I understand you will discuss a number of these aspects over the next few days. I wish you all the best with your conference. These are important questions. These are big questions. Listen good to the people following me, because this is one of the most important days you can have in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Minister, and your thoughtful reflections. Next up, we have MARTE ZIOLKOWSKI. She has served as a political advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs since 2019. She was acting State Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from October 2020 until January 2021. Previously, she has served as political advisor to the Minister of Defense. She has also worked as a foreign policy advisor to the Conservative Party's parliamentary group and as information advisor for the Norwegian Atlantic Committee. Marte, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and apologies for the kind of rough appearance, but we had a bit of a time rush here. Anyways, thank you so much, the foreign minister sends her regards to all of you. As you may know, the British Foreign Secretary is visiting today, and she is still in meetings with him and her Nordic colleagues. However, I am very happy to be here, especially since IATA has a special place in my heart. It has been almost a decade since I first discovered this kind of network of security policy geeks, and I was elected to the board just 4 floors above where I stand now. I'm also very happy to talk to you directly after my former boss, the Minister of Defense. He provided an excellent overview of the historic development of the Arab Spring, how it affected Western security, and how NATO responded, the backdrop for many of the regional developments that we live through today. I'd like to follow up on his remarks by touching briefly upon the current situation and some of the more recent trends. The foreign minister often reminds me of something she said during a trip to the region at the time of the Arab Spring. We've seen dictatorships fall, but with few exceptions, we've rarely seen democracies rise. And unfortunately, the Arab Spring quickly turned to winter. 10 years after the Arab Spring, there is still widespread unrest, underdevelopment and conflict in the region. It is often described as an arc of instability from Morocco in the west to the Gulf in the east. Many of the states are fragile, political governance is often autocratic, shaky or both, and human rights are under pressure. Over time, there have been many similarities across the region, and many still remain, but when the Arab Spring rose, it rose for different reasons in different cultural and political contexts, and it took different turns in the various countries. Given the time constraints, let me focus on 3 countries where developments in 2011 really grabbed the world's attention, and where what happened since did not turn out as we hoped. First, Syria. This week, we mark 10 long years of conflict in Syria. The war has caused immense suffering and widespread devastation. More than 5 million Syrians are refugees, over 6 million internally displaced. And an entire generation is growing up with no or limited access to education and knowing only conflict. The humanitarian situation is severe. For almost as long as the conflict has lasted, there has been a stalemate in the UN Security Council, caused by the veto powers who have put a stop to more or less any progress that could have been made. This has resulted in the situation deteriorating even further. In addition to lack of any political progress, gaining humanitarian access and providing aid is a major challenge. We're down from 2 to only 1 humanitarian access point in northwest Syria, where humanitarian aid gets through to the civilian population. Norway has taken a leading role in the UN Security Council, as we, together with Ireland, are penholders for the resolution on humanitarian access, working to ensure that the one border crossing at least remains open. Syria also remains by far the largest recipient of Norwegian humanitarian funds, regrettably with good reason. Libya has been another dark chapter in the decade since 2011. After the fall of Gaddafi, the country basically fragmented into warring clans and militias and has served as a battlefield by proxy for both regional actors and outside powers. The country has served as a major source of instability in the region for years, with the consequences also being felt in Europe in the form of major migration flows. Recent developments, however, gives us a slight hope of optimism. The ceasefire from October 23rd last year is still holding. And it was an important step for Libya when the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum elected an interim government, which was approved by the House of Representatives just yesterday. We are hopeful that it can provide much needed unity and stability before the upcoming elections in December. The final country that I would like to highlight is Egypt. The images from Tahrir Square were perhaps the most iconic of all that came out of the Arab Spring. The Mubarak regime was ousted and elections called, only for political reform and change to whittle away during a short interim rule by the Muslim Brotherhood, followed by a full-scale comeback by the military. Egypt remains a regional powerhouse with a strong hunger for stability and economic development, and focusing on infrastructure and welfare, while civilian and political rights are falling increasingly further behind. Human rights are under increased pressure. Social media and other platforms are under surveillance. Freedom of speech is practically non-existent. And the generations of Egyptians that went out in the streets in 2011 have almost disappeared from public view. This leads me to the current situation, because in many ways, the Arab Spring was based on socio-economic factors. People urged for better quality of life, safe jobs, and good governance. Very little of that has been delivered, meaning that frustration, anger, and lack of optimism is still strongly felt amongst the people, in particular amongst the younger population. Another factor that affects the younger generation in particular is the unemployment rate. In Egypt, for example, this window of opportunity has huge potential for increased trade and interaction between peoples and cultures. However, violent conflicts continue to be an impediment to regional stability, and we've seen that major players like China, Turkey, Iran, and Russia are increasingly trying to fill the space that the US left open when choosing a more remote approach to the region. China has within short time become a leading trading partner to many of the countries in the region. Russia keeps positioning strategically in many of the conflicts, with ambitions of strengthening the position even further. In case of the presence in Syria, this has strategic implications throughout the whole Mediterranean. The geopolitical changes that we are witnessing in the Middle East are likely to increase in the years to come. There is a different dynamic. Still, several unanswered questions remain. We have yet to see how Iran will act as the normalization agreements are put into practice. It is unlikely that there will be a solution to the conflict in Yemen anytime soon. We're still far from knowing how the conflict in Syria will end and what kind of political solution will be achieved. At the same time, the Biden administration are still settling in. So far, their focus is domestic. But could they return to having a stronger presence in the region? And if so, when? In the meantime, who will continue to fill the space left vacant by the US? All of this will affect the regional development in one way or another. And while strengthening regional stability could be within reach, it is difficult to make any certain predicaments. What remains certain is that either way the region will evolve, it will have consequences way beyond the region itself. This is, of course, just a brief overview. I know that you will learn much more about this in the upcoming days. and I'm confident that you will have inspiring and educational days. I wish you all the best for the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Marte. Next, for the next half an hour, we will hear from senior researcher at the Norwegian Norwegian Organization for International Affairs, Sverre Lodgaard. Sverre Lodgaard is a Norwegian political scientist who's held several senior positions within government and non-governmental organizations, including former director of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Lodgaard specializes in peace, foreign and security policy, but has also worked on developing country issues. He has since the 2000s written extensively on nuclear arms control, disarmament issues, and on Middle East affairs.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you and to discuss with you. I believe this is my third time before this forum, and I appreciate very much to be back with you. The Middle East is in a deplorable state of affairs, more so than 10 years ago, with the sole exception of Tunisia, where democracy took hold, but where the political process is currently stuck because of political controversies. And we should not take democracy in that country for a given. It may still unravel. The Spring countries were very different. The Tunisians and the Egyptians had a common history in their lands. Libya not. Libya had been ruled by colonial powers as 3 provinces: Fezzan in the south, Cyrenaica in the east, Tripolitania in the west. Tunisia had a small military force, and that force was apolitical. In Egypt, the military are ruling the country politically, and the military is a big actor in the economy of the country. Tunisia was only loosely knit together by Gaddafi, only loosely because he ruled the country by means of militias, small militias scattered throughout, typically led by family members. Other countries of the Arab Spring had more coherent governance systems. And Syria had the bad fate of becoming the geopolitical epicenter of an international civil war, while Tunisia benefited very much from being at a comfortable geographical distance from the geopolitics of the region. Only Tunisia had a reasonably strong civil society. What these countries had in common was the misery. Unemployment, corruption, social and economic injustice, repression. And on top of that, rulers who had been in office for decades. Ben Ali in Tunisia, 23 years. Mubarak in Egypt, 30 years. The Assads in Syria, father and son, 40 years. Gaddafi, 42. And they were all hated. So when the street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia, put himself on fire in despair over the humiliation and the harassment that he had been subject to, and Tunisians took to the streets. The scene was well prepared for a domino effect. It quickly spread to the other countries, first to Egypt. It resonated very well with the situation in other countries. It was all very, very familiar. Now, the commonality also included a lack of understanding of democratic practice, what democracy is about. To many people in the Middle East, there is no division between religion and politics. These are two entities of a seamless web. And if you see it that way, then there is no space for pluralism, for minority rights, and for rule of the people. Others have been pointing to the paternalistic ruling of traditional Arab tribes and draw a line from there to the authoritarian systems of the present. There may be many other explanations also. But the long and short of it is that people in the Middle East have no experience to speak of with democracy. And naturally, dictators shun education and discussion of the meaning of democracy. Still, in Egypt, the liberal educated youth who spearheaded the revolution, they had a pretty good sense of what democracy was about. And many leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood actually had that also. But many of them, the best of them, were put to jail. Morsi, the Brotherhood president, had some constructive, good initiatives in the beginning. But he soon succumbed to the mentality of winner takes it all. And when Sisi hit back, then he was an easy victim. An easy victim, maybe first of all because he had no revolutionary guard to protect himself, like the rulers in Tehran. And the military in Egypt never actually abdicated. They just bided their time. And in 2013 it was over. The military also formally took the reins. So today the situation is worse than when the spring started. And one has to ask, was it all in vain? The answer depends on whether you look at the Arab Spring as an event or as part of a process. Certainly seen as an event, it was unsuccessful, but I would say that is the wrong perspective. The spring metaphor, Arab Spring, it dates back to 1948 when Europe had a series of revolutions which were quelled. But from then on, democratic practice in Europe developed in fits and starts, took hold gradually, more and more. And 2011, the Arab Spring was the result of a process that had been building up over many years. In Egypt, for instance, we talked about it well before 2011, that Egypt was like a pressure cooker and in 2011 the lid sprang off. Today, the people in Egypt, more people than in 2011, are below the poverty line. Corruption is rampant. Political prisoners are in the tens of thousands, and there is more repression than before. Sisi's rule is harsher than Mubarak's. In that sense, the governance system in Egypt carries within it the drivers of another revolt. The French philosopher de Tocqueville once said, and he became famous for that, he said that a full-fledged dictatorship is a form of government that can be maintained over the long haul, over the decades and even centuries. But the semi-dictatorship, or when you begin to open up, that's a very difficult system to manage. Maybe the leaders in Egypt stake it on de Tocqueville's observation that he was right in what he said about the full-fledged dictatorship. But I doubt it very much, because political time flies faster these days, very much because of the communications revolution. So the leaders of Egypt today may live to be proven wrong. Again, the system has the drivers of another revolution inherent in it. Let me broaden the horizon. Zoom in on other countries in the Middle East. I pick the two most important ones, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia is a peculiar political system. The royal family is in a transactional relationship with the religious establishment. The royal family funds the Wahhabists, and they give legitimacy to the royals. Deeply conservative country, and I say that not only in reference to the rulers, to the royal family, but also in reference to the average citizen of Saudi Arabia. They have much to lose from another experiment, from a revolution. They are better off economically than most other people in the Middle East. And when they look around, and they have seen and heard about Nasser in Egypt, Assad in Syria, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Gaddafi in Libya, they are not enticed to go for a revolution. The conclusion there is that it is better to live with the devil that you know, better than to stake it on the devil that you have not yet seen. The Saudi system is special, first of all, in the sense that the royal family behave as if they own the entire peninsula. The incomes, basically from oil, goes to the royal family, and the royal family pays salaries in return. Public goods, not only money, must come from the top. That's the principle, from the top down. You have all heard about the brave young women who campaigned for the right of women to drive cars. After a while, the government declared that it would be allowed for women to drive cars, whereupon they put the lead campaigners in prison. And the message was quite obvious. Any good, money or public goods, must come from above, pressures from below will not be honored. The reaction might well be prison. There has been some improvement in the field of female human rights for women. Some improvements, but in the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report of 2020, Saudi Arabia is still listed as number 147 out of a total of 153 on the list. King Abdullah, who died in 2014, he was a reformer. I would say that Mohammed bin Salman still has to prove it, that he is a reformer as well. In the economic field, however, he has set out to implement reforms because the economy of Saudi Arabia, however rich Saudi Arabia has been, with low oil prices, the continuation is not so obviously good. The economy has to be based on more pillars, and hence he commissioned the report from McKinsey, referred to as Saudi Arabia 2030, in which it is emphasized that one has to encourage small and medium-sized firms, the establishment of small-sized firms throughout the country. The downside for the rulers is that if people are able to make incomes of their own, they will also naturally claim a say in public affairs. And hence the rulers have to balance economic reform against political repression. And the repression in Saudi Arabia is still very harsh, and much of it has come to the surface in connection with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. That has earned Saudi Arabia a lot of attention, which is problematical for the leaders. One possibility remains for destabilization of Saudi Arabia. Can there be a military coup? Saudi Arabia is buying weapons, mostly from the United States, much from Europe too. Modern weapons. Saudi Arabia ranks number 5 on the list of military expenditures in the world. The United States on top, of course, then China, then India, number 5. Saudi Arabia more or less on line with Russia, significantly above countries like the UK and France. And their officers are typically trained in the United States. Those who are training them would tell, however, that this is not going to be a good military force. And why not? Not because the rank-and-file soldiers are not brave, not because the Saudis are not able to organize. They have proven that they can organize. Saudi Aramco is usually, perceived as one of the best run oil companies in the world. Likewise with SABIC, the chemical conglomerate, established in 82, 25 years after. Later, that company was the second largest in its field in the world. No, it is not going to be effective, the Americans would tell, because the recruitment is not by professional merit, but by birth. Members of the royal family are recruited into the uppermost echelons. And why is that? That is because of the need to minimize, the possibility of a military coup. And those leaders, uppermost leaders, should not be too clever, because if clever people would grow in those positions, that could again raise the probability of a military coup. So the Saudi military, it's not a good fighting force, and in their foreign policy they are basing it on money more than on the military. There is a film called The Dissident, which is a documentary of Jamal Khashoggi, the surroundings, the ways the Saudis keep control, the repression techniques. I would recommend it. You don't find it on the Netflix, unfortunately. It will be shown in this country, in Oslo, during the Arab Film Days. But I'm sure that you can get hold of it somehow. There are many ways and means these days, and I hope you will do that. Iran then. Iran is also a very peculiar political system. This system has many centers. The supreme leader, who justifies his position the way the European kingdoms used to justify theirs, kingdoms of God's grace. There is the president, the parliament, the guardian council, very important. 12 clerics in that council. Their task is to see to it that laws passed by the parliament are in accordance with the principles of Islam. And the Guardian Council also decides on who is allowed to run for public office. Most of the applicants are deleted, but a number, passes, and then typically, when it comes to presidential elections, you might have three, four candidates. The judiciary is important in Iran, and the Revolutionary Guards certainly also. The role of the Guards is to control and defend the outer perimeter of the system. You could imagine, the system within a circle. The Guards, they protect and control the perimeter, and inside the various power centers compete for power and influence. They typically have their own media. And that way, when meeting Iranian diplomats internationally, you meet well-trained people. They have the training from home. They have the experience and the training on the home ground. Sometimes this is moving in a liberal direction, such as during the reformist president Khatami. Then came Ahmadinejad, an odd personality in Iran, I would say, a populist, a conservative in some respects, a pain in the neck for the supreme leader because he was so unpredictable. And then Rouhani, again, a move in a liberal direction. It goes a little bit back and forth, but all the time within that circle. And then people ask, is there light at the end of the tunnel? Can there be further progress? And I have to say, it doesn't look like that this is possible. There isn't much light in the tunnel, because in the other end of the tunnel, because there is no tunnel out of the circle. It is as if the Iranians are trapped within their own constitutional framework, within their own circle. And it's very hard, to build, say, on the progress in terms of liberal values, human rights, democratic practice, to build on that from one president to the next. The next president will probably be a conservative, and you can only expect a move backwards for the values that we believe in and that I am talking about here. Finally, what has been the role of, and is the role of external powers in all of this. During the Arab Spring, the United States sent NGOs to Egypt. First of all, to Egypt to promote the values, human rights, democratic practice. It seems that those who came there had not familiarized themselves with the Egyptian setting, with the landscape, and they were easy victims of the military and the deep Egypt. They were thrown out within 1 year. The NGOs were financed by the State Department. The Pentagon kept open communications lines with the military, so they played it safe. The Americans, not necessarily by design, but by, in a sense, a projection of their own system, because the State Department and the Pentagon often act separately. The European Union also got involved in the Arab Spring countries, and they had it right, the Europeans, on paper. More money for more democracy. That was the basic thinking. And they were more conscious of the internal conditions in the countries where they worked. But, as is often the case with the European Union, it was in the end too little too late. It didn't make a lasting impact. I published a book called External Powers and the Arab Spring back in 2016, following developments up to and including 2014. And I wanted the title of the book to be different, Little More Than Bystanders. Publisher didn't accept that title, they wanted a more traditional one. But Little More Than Bystanders summarizes, in a sense, the role of these external powers. How is that today? Saudi Arabia, interesting, again because of Jamal Khashoggi and what that has been leading to. President Biden has used strong words about Saudi Arabia. And he has imposed sanctions on Saudi Arabians, Saudis who have been responsible, co-responsible for the murder. He has not sanctioned MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and he has been criticized for that, but think it over. It is very rare that you sanction the leader of another country, and especially awkward if that leader is a leader of the country, of a country with which you have a lot of business. So I think that is a little unfair to criticize him for that. President Obama also had things to say about Saudi Arabia. But the long and short of it was nevertheless that by all means he didn't want to rock the boat. When King Abdullah died, he sent an historically strong delegation to the funeral. In addition to himself, Foreign Minister John Kerry, and to underline the continuity of the relationship, he also brought Condoleezza Rice and Jim Baker. He brought the head of US forces in the Middle East. He brought the chief of the CIA, and to underline that this was a bipartisan matter in the United States, close cooperation with Saudi Arabia. He also brought John McCain. I have not seen any such strong delegation sent to a funeral elsewhere. That's why I'm talking about an historically strong delegation here, again to emphasize the importance of Saudi Arabia for the United States. So what comes out of the verbal exercises that we can see these days is probably no more than ripples on the surface. It doesn't rock the fundamentals of the relationship. You may ask, why is that relationship so fundamentally important? And we might pick up on that in the Q&A if you so want. External powers today. I've talked about the United States and the European Union. Russia tries to turn ongoing conflicts in its own favor. Currently, not only in Syria, but also in Libya. But Russia is punching above its weight. China is the biggest investor in the Middle East, and they have an obvious interest in stability to protect their investments. And they act by the UN Charter, actually, by the principles of non-interference and non-intervention. Non-interference makes access to other countries easier. Non-intervention can be used to deny Western powers legitimacy when they want to use force in the region. But none of these powers, Russia and China, are known to be supporters of democracy. So there isn't much help. To sum it up, there isn't much help to expect from external powers when it comes to democracy and human rights in the Middle East. Democracy has to come from within. And I don't think what happened in 2011 has been in vain. Some seeds have been sown, and international civil society can be enablers of more effective action in support of democratic practice in the future. They can teach, they can make the Middle Easterners better understand what democracy is about. The Europeans in particular would be in a good position to do that. So in summary, I would say, please judge the Arab Spring in process terms and not as a singular event. And if you do that, the prospect is not necessarily all bleak. There can be further progress, maybe fits and starts also in the Middle East, the way it has been in our history, European history. Thank you very much.
Excellent reflections. Now we will have a 5-minute break before the Q&A. So please, if you have any more questions, now is the time, and we will be back live in 5 minutes.
On to the questions. First, is the idea of democracy in the Middle East a Western dream, fueling conflict, rather than a realistic possibility? I would hate to believe that this is a Western dream simply, because that would mean that we would let a lot of people in the Middle East down. There is no doubt that the populations of the Middle East, they want radical change, and they do want radical change to give them basic human rights, not least the right to speak, the freedom of expression, freedom of organization. They need different governing systems to get control of the rampant corruption in very many of these countries. Worst in Egypt, when the military rules the country politically and is the biggest actor in the economy. That's like an advertisement on the first page of New York Times for corruption. Iran has much of the same problem. The Revolutionary Guard, important politically, a rather big actor economically. It's not as bad as in Egypt, but it is bad enough. So I think we owe it to people in the Middle East who long for basic human rights and democratic practice. We owe it to them never to consider democratic pursuits as a dream. There is a role for us in Europe too, for the Nordic countries, others, to prepare the ground for democratic change in the region. First of all, maybe by supporting civil society, the seeds that exist in various countries of civil societies. Another question: how unfortunate do you think the anti-West sentiments stemming from Western interventions are? And those anti-Western sentiments, they are obviously running very high. The use of force in the Middle East to promote democratic change has been, as we all know, a blatant failure. And very much of the misery that we have seen in this century in the Middle East is actually due to the military interventions. The only upside of international intervention in Iraq was the removal of Saddam Hussein, and likewise in Libya, the only upside, the removal of Gaddafi. Do you believe that state leaders in the MENA region are exploiting the pandemic to control the population? I have to admit that I'm not, well enough versed, to answer that question. It hasn't struck me so far that they have been using the pandemic to better control the population. I may be wrong, but seen from a distance, I would say no. I don't think they have been in a position, been able to, or have wanted to exploit the pandemic. How has the Arab Spring and consequent events impacted Nordic security and Nordic security relations? In the Nordic region, again, we have about the same advantage as we have noted for Tunisia. We are at a comfortable distance from the geopolitics of the region. And it seems to me that we are involved in the Middle East very much through the European Union, Norway a bit less so than the other Nordic countries, being members of the Union. But even Norway, we follow very much the lead of the European Union. When it comes to sanctions, for instance, we have been following the European Union lead all the time in relation to Iran, in relation to other countries. So we get involved through that channel. Norway may get involved also via NATO. When NATO is engaged, when NATO wants to do something special in the Middle East, the issue is also on our table. I have said enough about the use of force, and I think that lesson, it has gone down. That lesson, has been duly noted. There is no, in a sense, need to speak more about that. But the question is much more what can be done, what NATO can do in non-military sectors, where I believe that support for civil society on the premises of Middle Eastern countries themselves has to have a central place. Whenever you see an opening for that, often you can't see an opening, so there is nothing doing, and then you'd better stay off. But here and there are all the time openings. How would you simply explain the link and possible causality between the Arab Spring and the rise and fall of the Islamic State? I see these issues as basically separate issues. The rise of the Islamic State, it begins very much in Iraq, 2003. The chaos in Iraq, which made for huge openings for what became the Islamic State. First Al-Qaeda, then Islamic State, Al-Nusra in Syria. So there's a chain of events and developments there, starting with the unfortunate war in Iraq that led to the creation of the Islamic State. The Arab Spring is on a different trajectory. And that trajectory, as I have emphasized already, it goes rather far back in time. It was a process, gradually, developing, building up to what became the Arab Spring. But that's a different story, I feel, from the story of the Islamic State. In Egypt, for example, maybe there is a follow-up question. Can it not be argued that strong autocratic leaders like Assad, Saddam and Gaddafi are better for stability and secularism in the region? A qualified yes to both parts of that question. Stability for as long as it holds. Secularism, yes. These rulers were first of all despotic rulers. They were not bothering too much about religion. Now and then they would try to twist religion in their favor to support their rule. But yes, Turkey too. The military has been the strongest supporter of secularism. Erdogan has brought religion back into Turkish political life. But the stability reference, yes, Egypt was seemingly stable up to 2011, and then you saw what happened. I would hope that there would be other possibilities also for Egypt in the future to come back to some of the values that the young generations, educated cohorts in Egypt tried to promote. In Egypt, for example, where the military is powerful and economically controlling, how do you envision the next step in the process of establishing democracy? Hands up on that one. The next step, it's very hard to sort of predict. What I have been saying, I can only repeat that the governance system in Egypt is of such a kind that it has in it inherently a drive towards another, if not revolution, another big effort to make a change. The developments that I outlined up to 2011, the drivers of what became the Arab Spring, are even stronger drivers today. And the system is trying to counter those drivers by becoming even more harsh. I don't think that situation can be expected to be stable over the decades. 10 years have passed since the Arab Spring. Who dares guess that this system will remain like that, will be able to go on for another 10 years? Open question. But I pass on the more specific question here. What will be the next step? Let me see.
I think our time is running out.
We have come to the end. Thank you for reminding me of that.
No problem. Thank you so much for your excellent reflections.
Thanks for all the questions. There are more even on the list here, but as you said, there's an end to everything, and our time is out. So again, thank you very much. It's been very good to be with you and to see all these questions.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. LODGAARD, and thank you very much for your excellent reflections. Now, as our final part of today's program, we will have a movie screening by Jaima Bourlel. She is a civic society leader and transparency expert. She joined Alba Wassala in 2014 to start and lead Marsad Baladia, an observatory that monitors all municipalities across Tunisia. She was elected as president of Al Babsala in October 2016. From 2016, she started co-hosting a weekly radio show on the national radio, discussing public policy and public institutions' performance. So I would thank you all very much for tuning in today. We'll be back again tomorrow with a packed and excellent program. Thank you for tuning in.
It is in a modern Arabic literature class that I had taken as a sophomore in college, sometime in 2008, that I became fully aware of the limits of referring to one's homeland as a female body, one to be protected and fought for as one would protect their pride and honor, with forms of the limits of referring to one's homeland as a female body, one to be protected and fought for as one would protect their pride and honor, with forms of attacking it, or even worse, stealing and colonizing it, depicted through the gruesome images of rape. It is perhaps then, long before